Brown, Distinguished Professor, Distinguished University Professor of Complexity, Social Science and Management at the University of Michigan, and the Williamson Family Professor of Business Administration at the Stephen M. Ross School of Business. He's also Professor of Political Science, Professor of Complex Systems, and Professor of Economics, and the Leonid Hurwitz Collegiate Professor and External Professor at the Santa Fe Institute. So I think you have the record for professorships, and deservedly so. Not to be snide. Anyway, you're also the author, Scott's the author of several seminal books on complexity and modeling, including Complex Adaptive Systems, an introduction to computational models of social life with John Miller, that I think we all regard as one of the real pillars of the field. More recently, The Model Thinker, What You Need to Know to Make Data Work for You, which I enjoy immensely. I think that's another great book on modeling. Most recent books really couldn't be more timely. Two of them, one on the diversity bonus and the other, the difference, how the power of diversity creates better groups, firms, schools, and societies. That's both, you know, theoretically important and socially very important. So I think that's also very, very commendable and fascinating work. Scott's certainly among the most important and productive thinkers in our field, and it's been my great good fortune to have him as a scientific colleague and very dear friend for many years. And it is now my great good fortune to hear him speak on the topic of Beyond Allocation, how ABMs can transform the study and design of institutional ensembles. So Scott, welcome, and we're all thrilled to have you here.
Thank you so much, Josh, for that introduction. And it's great to be here. It's great to see so many faces I know and names I know with faces. So really quick, I want to thank Josh and Bill for this opportunity, because I want to talk about a research project I've been working on for the last 5 or 6 years. And when offered this opportunity, I thought, I'm not quite really working exactly in this space, but what it did is over the last 4 or 5 months, it's caused me to think really deeply about how I can push the research I'm doing and also some just fundamental questions I'm interested in forward by taking this mindset. So it's just been really, really productive for me to try to just sort of absorb this sort of inverse generative social science approach within my own work. So I want to kind of share that story in a way today, and we'll see how this works. So I'm going to share my screen here and go to slideshow, and here we go. I'll throw the chat up, so if you can, if anything terrible goes wrong, just let me know or raise your hand. I'll try and see you. So this is joint work with Jenna Bednar, who is my partner in research and in life. I want to start by talking about kind of where this is going to fit in. So as Josh mentioned, there's a book called The Model Thinker, and then I talk about sort of core reasons to model and how complex your models should be. And this is where really, this is some ideas borrowed from Josh in part, depending on what you're trying to use the model for, right? If I'm trying to communicate, I want the model to be pretty simple. If I'm trying to predict and I don't care about any sort of causal explanation at all, I can make it as complex as I want it to be, right? I just want to get accuracy and prediction. And when I'm exploring like I am today, I can actually sort of err on the side of maybe being a little bit more, having a few more moving parts than I might naturally have. Okay, so here's a quick outline. I want to talk about this thing called implementation science and link it to IGSS, because I think the fact is that there's 2 different communities that are both kind of critically important to social science as it intersects with policy, and they're coming at it in very different ways. I'm going to talk about the notion of sort of institutional design as market is just a partial equilibrium. I'll then get to this notion of sort of petri dishes and dark matter, which is kind of fun, and talk about systems perspective on institutional design, which is what this research project is about. As I do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up right up against something called Coleman's boat, which is this notion that sort of we can explain things at the macro level, we can explain things at the micro level, we can explain the full system. And Josh talked about this at length in his talk. And we'll see then how what we're currently doing in social science, especially in the area of institutional analysis, is really kind of a failure at the level of Coleman's boat because of the fact that we're not using agent zero. We're kind of using a combination of surveys and a combination of models. And it's really, kind of a pins and string social science as opposed to an integrative approach. And I think it really matters to go sort of the agent zero approach. And what I'm going to do at the end is talk about how, if we want to explain this dark matter, which I'll get to in a second, we need to construct something I'm going to call the Georgian Hypercube, which is another way to sort of think about IGSS. So There's a fabulous Freakonomics episode with Dana Susskind, and she and her partner John List have done a lot of sort of like just path-breaking work. He's the chair of the University of Chicago Econ Department on sort of natural experiments. And she's brutally honest in this podcast because she basically says, you know what? It almost never works when you take it someplace else. It always works in the treatment, and then you like take it someplace else and it never works because you've kind of got perfect conditions, and everybody's bought in, and so there's a problem there. What's intriguing is you'll hear people say the following. This is an anonymous quote by someone who'd like to be on the Freakonomics podcast. If you just change a few parameter values, you get different results. Agent-based values models are of no value. These are sort of same song, different verse in a way. I mean, the fact that like you can tweak a few things in an agent-based model and get different results is exactly the reason why Dana Susskind is saying, hey, you know what? When I put this institution here, it worked fantastic. And I put it over here, it didn't work. And what we really need to understand is what are all the variables that matter, right? And one of the things that we do in social science so often, and I think Josh has been super eloquent on this, as has Bill in his work, that we need to sort of increase the dimensionality of our models, because if we don't, we're just going to be stuck in this endless loop. I want to begin by thinking about this notion of design, particularly institutional design, as partial equilibrium. So here's what I was trained in as an economist, right? That there's an environment out there. And then we sit around with the philosophers and we think about, okay, this environment consists of technology, preferences, all these sorts of things. And there's some social choice correspondence, which is kind of what we want to happen in the world. And what we'd like to do is, given what we've got, the resources we've got, the technology, come up with some sort of allocation or decision. That's a wonderful thing, right? That gives it kind of, you know, everybody's has reasonable wealth and opportunity and dignity and these sorts of things. Well, how do we do that? Well, we construct institutions. We construct a market, a democracy, some sort of hierarchy. And then what happens is, given those institutional rules, people behave in some way, and then there's an outcome function. And what we want in mathematical terms is this diagram to commute. We want the outcome function applied to the behavior to align with the social choice correspondence. One might say that like the history of attempts to improve the world are cases where OME does not equal F, right? Where a beautiful plan confronts reality, right? And that's in some sense what Dana and Professor Susskind is talking about. Now, trained as a game theorist, what you do is you say, well, behavior is rational behavior, and the outcome then is a Nash equilibrium. And so it might be, if we're doing some sort of divide the dollar game or something, the equilibrium is 60-40. Here's where the Petri dish comes in. You can think of what we might call culture, and also called dark matter, is the place in which we put this institution. And so this is Dana Suskind's idea of like, you know, it worked here and it didn't work someplace else. Or if I change a few parameters in my agent-based model because there's so many degrees of freedom, I get a different result. Now we know empirically, and there's a wonderful book on this by Joseph Henrich called The Weirdest People in the World, just about how sort of white educated industrialized countries differ from other countries, but also even within white educated industrialized countries, there's differences. If I play divide the dollar game in the US, you know, ultimatum game, the person who offers will tend to take, you know, closer to 70%, and in Sweden, it'll be closer to 50-50. So place the exact same game in two different Petri dishes, you get two different outcomes. This is one of the core questions in development economics, comparative political science, right? To what extent does the culture matter, and to what extent does the institution matter? And the answer is, you know, we know sort of empirically both. So Jeff Mulgan, recently he was knighted, so I should call him Sir Jeff Mulgan now, right? He says, what really makes societies tick isn't just the surface facts, the institutions or laws. These are important, but it's these norms, dispositions, cultures in their wider sense, how people make sense of the world. And right now, if you're not thinking agent zero, start thinking agent zero, right? And how they solve their problems. It's this behavioral stuff. Oops, weird is Western. I'm sorry, thank you, Joseph. Not white. These can be thought of as equivalent to dark matter in physics, right? We see them through their effects on other things rather than directly. But we tend to construct models that focus on these things like preferences and technologies. So how do social scientists, political scientists, sociologists deal with this? People who study organizational culture and businesses. Well, one approach, and this is my colleague Ron Engelhardt, who recently passed away, was to survey people around the world and then use factor analysis. And Ron finds kind of two factors. One is, are you survival focused or kind of interested in well-being? And one is, are you sort of traditional or more sort of secular rational? And what you see is you can plot different countries on this. This is all coming from survey data. And you see that different regions of the world kind of end up in different places, right? Which is why this sort of Western looks different from Eastern, Northern looks different from Southern, this sort of thing, right? Now, another approach, and this is here at Hofstede's work, is to you rely on larger surveys and kind of cheat a little bit on your factor analysis and have more dimensions. And he has a whole bunch of dimensions: power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, indulgence. And if you compare, like, the United States to, let's say China, look at the individualism. The United States gets a score of 91, China gets a score of 20. So you can imagine if my agent zeros are more individualistic, when I drop that institution in there, right, I'm going to get different results. Now, the way we currently think about this is we sort of say, okay, we can use rational choice theory and sort of say, let's put this institution in place and see what outcome we get. Then you can say, well, maybe we can do some sort of like cultural correction a little bit for sort of individualism, right? The US is more individualistic, less altruistic, we're more entrepreneurial, whatever. Maybe we can just tweak things. And there's some wonderful work by people like, Bruce Buenedi-Mesquita, who's analyzed like how bargaining occurs, where he kind of takes the standard model and then kind of figures out, how do I tweak this thing to sort of get a slightly better estimate by using cultural factors. That's kind of how we do it now, but it's really got this kind of masking tape. What that approach completely ignores is where those differences come from. Now, famous book by Robert Putnam talking about northern and southern Italy, he says, well, they come from the mist of the Dark Ages. And he's kind of saying this tongue in cheek. He's saying, we just can't who knows, right? We're just going to take it as given that there's these differences. So for the past decade, I've been working with Jenna Bender and some other people on experimental models, agent-based models, and mathematical models, trying to understand kind of a systems model of institutional change. So here's sort of the standard way we might think about things. I'm going to choose some sort of institution, a market, a democracy of hierarchy, and I'm going to get some allocation, right? And if you read the literature, I'm going to go through this fast, I'll share the slides. You can find people like Hayek saying, look, markets work because what they do is they aggregate diverse information, right? And so they're smarter than individual people. And then Herb Simon, a very smart person, said, oh, organizations work because they're able to sort of like, do computations individual people can't do. And Elaine Landemore, a leading political theorist, says, oh, the reason democracy works is because the knowledge of the whole is better than the knowledge of individuals. So all three of these rely on this notion of collective intelligence, but in very different ways. And so what you can think then, though, when I now construct an institution or choose an institution, market, democracy, hierarchy, I get allocations, right? And those allocations depend on the properties of those institutions. But I also get what I'm going to call civic capacity effects, which I'm going to think of as the Petri dish or as Mulligan's dark matter, in the sense that, and hopefully Matt Jackson will talk about this some tomorrow, but when I construct an institution, I get things like networks, beliefs, behaviors, right? So if I take a bunch of agent zeros and just kind of randomly create them and put them in a market, the agent zeros I've got after that are different than the agent zeros I had before that. And so people who interact in a lot of markets are going to end up looking different than people who interact in a bunch of democracies or hierarchies. So when we first started this project, we sort of thought of it this way, that civic capacity affects institutions and then institutions affect civic capacity, and it's like a system. That's true, but sort of, I think a better way to think about it is to think of it more in a temporal effect. That civic capacity, you have institution A, that affects allocations, that affects civic capacity. Now I add another institution, because as societies become more complex, you sort of accumulate institutions, right? And so now institution A could get changed, but I want to view this kind of more horizontally. And so what you get then is you get a lot of sort of path dependence, because when I choose an institution, I'm affecting civic capacity, and that civic capacity is going to affect the choice of future institutions. So how do you model this? Now I want to start out by describing a high-level model that we've been playing with, just to try and make sense of what might these civic capacity spillovers do. So let's imagine we've got now 4 types of institutions: markets, hierarchies, democracies, and self-organization. Now, self-organization here, I'm just going to say, is kind of like let her rip. So like, for example, how you decide to drive to work, purely self-organized, right? There's no market, there's no hierarchy, there's no democracy. Some countries have markets, right? Real-time pricing for roads. We don't. Market probably works better there, right? At least in a larger city. So what you've got here is we've got an allocation problem, we've got a decision problem, we've got to choose some institution. What you could imagine is, and this is how, and I want to be critical but kind, all of the work being done right now on sort of like natural experiments, institutional design, right? In economics, right? This whole like proving causality, A/B testing of institutions, it's this partial equilibrium sort of approach. You sort of say, let's try a bunch of different things, right? Let's try market, hierarchy, self-organization, democracy. Let's see which one works best. Market works best. Let's choose the market, right? It completely ignores the spillovers. So it's a purely partial equilibrium analysis. And it kind of says, markets works best, so we'll choose the market. Next time hierarchy works best, we'll choose the hierarchy. So this time we choose the market. If you look at a university, so you can think of this almost like the DNA of a society, right? Instead of ACTG, you've got hierarchy, market, democracy, self-organization. So you get little MHDSs. So at a university, the courses we teach at most places are determined by a hierarchy. Our salaries are kind of determined by a market. Tenure is determined by democracy. And how we allocate our time is largely self-organized. We could have a market for how we allocate our time. Like it could be that like Josh would have on his door $75 an hour, right? I'd have 36 cents an hour. Bill might have $300 an hour because he knows how to program, right? So we'd all have these like prices on our doors and there would be real-time clearance. And you can imagine that would be more efficient in some ways, but think of what that would do to civic capacity, right? I mean, each one of us would kind of have some sense of our sense of worth based on this price, even if this was sort of internal funny dollars, and that would change the dynamics of how people interact. So let me start with a really simple model, get rid of self-organization for a second, just so I can draw some pictures, where I just have markets, hierarchies, and democracies. And I want to think of there being some ensemble that consists of a mixture. So there's some percentage markets, some percentage hierarchies, and some percentage democracies, right? And I'm just going to start out by assuming positive feedback. Some of markets help markets, hierarchies help hierarchies, democracies help democracies, in the following sense. So here's the idea. If I'm in a lot of markets, I'm just good at operating in markets. So it's going to make markets relatively better. If I'm in a lot of hierarchical organizations, I'm good at power authorities, I'm good at following rules, right? It's going to make hierarchies better. If it's in a democracy, I'm good at negotiating, good at influencing people, so we learn those sorts of skills. So the more democracies I'm in, the better I'm at acting in a democracy. So the way I can think about this is I can think about civic capacity for markets as being the percentage of markets raised to some power. Civic capacity for hierarchies being hierarchies raised to, I'm just keep it the same power. And you can think of this beta as being sort of like the vulnerability. So if beta is really, really high, right? Then I'll put a function in a second. Beta gets close to 1. I've got kind of a linear function. So if I need quite a few markets to have markets be useful, to have civic capacity for markets. If beta is close to 0, then even just a few markets, a small percentage of markets, means I'm fine. If I'm in 10% markets, I can operate really, really effectively in a market. So now I'm going to say the realized value of an institution depends on 2 things. So here's where this down here on the bottom is, I think, the real innovation here. And this is the thing we're going to unpack throughout the talk. In an ideal world with rational agents, each one of these institutions would have a potential, and that's in the kind of that top of that Mount Rider diagram, like markets would work perfectly here, or a hierarchy would work great here. Each one of these, given a context, is likely to work better, right? There's going to be some like score in terms of how well it would do. However, any given society or school or organization, their ability to reach that potential depends on their civic capacity for that type of institution. So if we suck at markets, right, then what's going to happen is we're not going to achieve, right, a very high payoff, even if a market worked really well. So the example I was giving to my undergrads is I was in Kroger, which is the grocery store here in Michigan. And Michigan gets a lot of immigrants from the Middle East. And this guy in front of me has a bunch of groceries on the thing going across. And it's $27. And he says, I'll give you 20. This cashier is like, what? And he's like, I'll give you 20. And she's like, it's 27. He's like, only got 20. And this goes on for a minute. Then he's, oh, I just found another dollar. I got 21. And so then I had to say, excuse me. I said, did you just move here? And he said, yeah, no, I just moved here from Lebanon. And I said, we don't do that in the grocery store. I said, you just kind of follow the rules. This is the price. He's like, you're kidding me. And I'm like, no, that's how it goes. He goes, well, that's no fun. I said, I know it's no fun, but just how we roll here, right? And he clearly had like a couple $100. It wasn't like he was short of money. He was just like, we negotiate, but that's just not how we roll. And so the thing is, if you don't have the civic capacity to work in a rule-based system, it's not going to work well. So this vulnerability, this exponent, is going to be the key parameter here. When it's really low, it means that civic capacity is highly convex. And it's going to mean that so we're really good at almost any institution if we just get a little experience with it. When it's high, when beta gets close to 1, civic capacity is pretty linear. So if I don't have a lot of experience in markets, I'm not going to be very good at it. So vulnerability and curvature kind of go in the opposite direction. If there's low curvature, it's high vulnerability. If it's high curvature, there's low vulnerability. Again, the idea here is low vulnerability civic capacity means we're really good at working in all these institutions if we just have a little bit of exposure to them. So what you could do is, let's suppose we've got more democracies than markets than hierarchies. You can imagine if the potential values are on the interval from 0 to 1, then the realized values, which are sort of civic capacity times potential values, for hierarchies, they're going to be kind of like in this sort of closer in interval, right? Because this is kind of max, this is the civic capacity of hierarchy. So those are going to be sort of distributed from 0 to CH, for markets from 0 to CM, and for democracies from 0 to CD. And so what you see here is if there's a lot more civic capacity for democracies than markets and hierarchies, we're going to be much more likely to draw from a democracy, right? Because we're just drawing from a much wider distribution. And again, here I'm assuming uniform distribution just so I can draw the picture. And so then you can figure out what's the probability if I was randomly drawing out potential values and then multiplying those by civic capacity, that hierarchy would win, that market would win, the democracy would win. This is just an algebra exercise, right? And what you get is there's going to be an ensemble equilibrium, which is going to satisfy the case where the percentage of hierarchies equals the probability of picking a hierarchy given beta, right? And the percentage of markets equals the probability of picking a market, which is the percentage of probability of picking a hierarchy plus this other term. And the probability of picking democracy is just 1 minus the probability of picking the other two. So how does that work? Let's just draw a simple picture here. And now we'll start getting into this, how this relates to IGSS in a really fascinating way. And this is what I found just really cool about thinking about this general problem that this community is trying to address. If there's high vulnerability, so that if I don't have a lot of experience with democracies and markets or hierarchies, I'm not good at it. What you get is the basins of attraction point to all markets, all democracies, or all hierarchies. If there's moderate vulnerability, what you get is you get either kind of a market-dominated society, a democratic-dominated society, or a hierarchically dominated society, right? Because you're not quite as good at democracy. If you've got a market-dominated society, you're not quite as good at democracies or, I lost my thing, there we go, or hierarchies as you are markets. But the point is that you sort of like figure it out, right? You can kind of get by. If I have low vulnerability, what happens is I have this wonderful thing where we get equal numbers of markets, hierarchies, and democracies, right? So all three of them sort of are working out fine. So now so that's kind of a simple mathematical thing when I think about basins of attraction. Now I want to ramp it up and go to a more complicated version. So the modern version of the choice actually includes not just markets, hierarchies, and democracies, but also, as I mentioned before, kind of self-organization, where you say we're not going to have an institution. And we have to now include algorithms. And why do we have to include algorithms? Because a lot of stuff, whether it's, medical school residencies, whether it's where you get your, whether you can get a shot, right? There's all these cases now where we use algorithms to allocate outcomes. And this is Jerry Davis, and I spent a lot of time talking about this. Patrick Grimm, who's here, has talked about this a lot with us as well, that algorithms can be really efficient. And there's a whole group called Mechanism Design for Social Good, but that's mostly around designing algorithms. But we have to think really carefully about what these algorithms are doing to civic capacity, right? Because they're not creating social networks. They're not necessarily creating, certain types of skills. They're not necessarily creating altruism, right? And so we want to think about what's going to happen. So algorithms I want to think of in sort of the Hannah Fry sense, that just these pieces of code that we're using to sort of like organize how we do things, okay? So now I'm going to do the same sort of model where now I've just got percentage of markets, percentage of hierarchies, percentage of democracies, percentage of self-organization, percentage of algorithms. And I'm going to do a constructed scenario. So I'm going to have democracy. There's positive feedbacks between markets, hierarchies, democracy, self-organization, algorithms, just like I had before, that beta term. But now I'm going to have a spillover from democracies to markets. And the basis for this is as follows. There's strong evidence that like democracies can develop increased levels of trust, and markets depend on trust. And so if democracy is producing trust, yes, that helps democracies, but it also helps markets. What happens if you do this? On the bottom here on the horizontal axis is the size of the spillovers. Now I want to start out in the moderate vulnerability case. So I'm starting out with the equilibrium that's democracy dominated. So I'm starting with 70% democracies and 15% of everything else. Or I'm sorry, 5%, 6% of everything, 7% of everything else. Right? So it's mostly democracies, and the other 30% are concentrated in the other 4 institutions. As I start increasing that spillover from democracies to markets, I get democratic collapse. Like the system, it's kind of hanging on, it's, you know, it's mostly democratic, and then woo, right? You quickly get, we're mostly markets. And so this is why, and this isn't the spillover here is 0.075 is the size of the spillover. Remember, realized values are between 0 and 1. Civic capacity is the square root of 1. So this is maybe the spillover is, you know, 10%, 15% of fundamental value. So that's not huge, right? Again, this is highly stylized, but the point is democratic collapse happened pretty early. So there's this weird thing that Jen and I call in this paper, the paradox of civic capacity building. If you have an institution like democracy that builds civic capacity for other types of institutions, if it suddenly gets better at it, it can wipe itself out. Right? Because what it's doing is it's building dark matter that helps the other institutions. And then because of the positive feedbacks on the other institutions, they do better. But then you can say, we can just get more complicated here. Democracy also helps self-organization, right? Democracy spills over to hierarchies, but maybe less so. So I'm going to draw that in gray lines. Well, if I do that, now suddenly I just get the slow degradation of democracy, not some sort of collapse, as a function of the spillover, right? And I could also say, what if I introduce, let's suppose that there's, with these algorithms, that algorithms reinforce markets. And these are just constructed scenarios to just give you some sort of feel for what might go on. If I do this, I get technology-driven democratic collapse. Because what happens is that, you know, I'm kind of fine, and then all of a sudden, like I get a few more markets, and the markets help the algorithm. So democracy is helping the markets. So the blue line's going up as democracy helps the markets, the dark blue line. When I start getting more markets, that starts feeding into the algorithms, and the algorithms and markets have this positive interaction. They go up, democracy's feeding them, and the democracy collapses, and I'm in this algorithm market world. Okay. Now, I've completely set aside for a second the utility that comes from these things. We'll get there in a second, but just hold in your head, these suck at the end. When I'm all markets and algorithms, I'm a world of selfish people probably, right, who aren't doing it. Because I've only got, when I get an opportunity, if it's really good for democracies or self-organization or hierarchies, I've got no civic capacity, right? And so I can't do them. So I'm ending up with only 2 types of institutions. So I end up with something that's not very good. So now let me bring this towards, otherwise I've gone like 30 minutes. Now I'm going to get to where this conference has really changed how I think about this. Before I was thinking about this kind of from an inverted systems thinking perspective, right? So I kind of had this is kind of like a basins approach. And I could imagine saying, let me draw all the models out there. Let me just draw boxes and arrows between them with different betas and different spillovers and positive and negative spillovers, and say, which of these lead to democratic collapse? Which of these lead, Patrick smiling a little bit, the Hobbesian cold, brutish, and short existence? And which of these lead to like robust flourishing? Now, the other thing is you could say, maybe these aren't even the only 3 things. Like, so one of this is where I said this is exploratory modeling. It's like, let me just roll this sucker out, draw arrows, search around, and then like try and come up with sets of categories. And this is where you could use machine learning on this and sort of say, wow, there actually are, you know, 5 categories that can occur. And here's what's true about the underlying boxes and arrows and things like this that give me categories 1 through 5, right? Here's what I realized though, after I was doing that. I'm like on the surface of Coleman's boat, right? So if you take a graduate sociology course, one of the sort of core models is the Coleman's boat model, which says there's an aggregate state at time t and an aggregate state at time t plus 1. There's agents at time t and there's agents at time t plus 1. What you want Coleman's boat model does is that there's a dynamic F on the agents. There's a dynamic H on the aggregate states, and there's an aggregation dynamic. What Coleman says is good social science has all H, F, and A, right? So you're explaining how at the aggregate level, the aggregate statistic is working. And this is, I mean, this is just another way of saying what Josh said. At the agent level, I know what's going on. And the agent level produces the aggregate level. And some of what we're trying to do here in this community is to say, what are the possible agent things down there? See, this is where, I mean, Coleman would be like, oh my gosh, my book was only 947 pages long. I would have added another 100 pages just on this, right? He would have loved this. I mean, Coleman would have loved this because he would be like, look, you're right. We need to think of all the different ways we can do this at the micro level, right? What are all the different ways we can have this work at the micro level and have it be consistent with what's happening at the macro level? Now, there's a little bit of an issue. I have an issue with Coleman's boat in that this is the diagram that's kind of a mashup of stuff that Rob Axtell has done and Josh has done as well. But I think agent-based modeling has a little bit more of an aggregation diagram here, even possibly the meso level, where what's going from micro to macro sometimes is simple aggregation, sometimes it's emergent, right? In a sense that like you can't necessarily explain what's going on, but there's also a micro to macro dynamic, right? So in addition to HF and A, individuals react to the macro thing. And that it's kind of implicit in how Coleman writes it up, but this is really what's going on. So now I'm thinking, oh my God, I've only been at the surface level. Hopefully I'm not going to see Josh in the next 3 months or something, right? Because I'm completely ignoring all the interesting stuff. And that was just because what I wanted to do is just kind of ask, what does the macro level here look like? And then I realized, because Ron Engelhardt, unfortunately, just passed away 2 weeks ago. Ron used to walk by my house every day, and I would often run out and ask him questions. It's kind of great to have a world famous social scientist walking by your house every day. You can just go, "Hey, Ron, I have a question." I realized that like what Ron did and what Hofstein did, as impressive as it was, isn't up to the task of what this community wants to do, right? And it gives us an amazing opportunity. It's also not up to the task what Dana Susskind and all the people doing sort of A/B testing of institutions want to do. And I want to call this just kind of pins and strings social science or masking tape, because here's why it doesn't work. So here's Ron. Survey hundreds and hundreds of people from hundreds of countries over a 30-year period with panel data, and you can watch videos of these countries moving over time. So this one has little arrows showing how countries have moved. Fabulous work, right? This is Hofstede again, right? You've got these 5 dimensions. How do I use this? And this is the thing that, Jen and I puzzled over a long time. This is supposed to be like the lower level of Coleman's boat. These are the people, right? This is what they're like, right? This is the Petri dish in a way. Here's what economists do. And I'm not saying this is bad. This is an important first step. Here's what economists do. This is an AER survey paper on does culture affect economic outcomes? This is the title of the paper. Define cultural narrowly, preferences and expectations. Right here, like wave your agent-based modeling flag. Like, but you see, like, no, that you're missing the entire point if you're saying culture is expectations and preferences, right? It's like saying your car is the radio. Second, show expectations and preferences have an impact on economic outcomes, right? Hopefully causal. 3, and here's the one that I just like say, wow, this is why I'm no longer in an economics department. Avoid causal linkages between economics and culture, right? So completely ignore this thing that I've been talking about up till now, the fact that like somehow what happens in the economy is going to affect culture. It's a system. So totally ignore that, okay? What you're kind of doing here is you're kind of saying, I've got macro phenomena at time t, I've got macro phenomena at time t+1. I don't know anything about these micro actions at time t, because I'm not observing things. What I'm doing is I'm surveying people. So I've got a survey response kind of like taking the effect of micro actions. And then I'm drawing the arrow that doesn't even exist in this diagram, kind of asking, can I find correlation between the survey responses and the micro phenomena at time t+1, right? Using some sort of regression model. Or regression discontinuity, right? Or, oh, I found an actual experiment, or here's an instrumental variable, but some way to, really good empirical social science. But that really good empirical social science, because of the nature of these, because it's survey data, doesn't lend itself to what we want to do, right? So then I thought, how do you do this, right? So suppose I wanted to construct agent-based model foundations of this. But what I could do is instead, I could say, let's think of when an institution comes in, like I'm going to play a game, and there's 3 strategies I could play in this game. One is kind of a corrupt strategy, which means the outcome is going to be bad. Another is kind of a safe strategy, which means like a mediocre outcome. And one is a best strategy. It's kind of the efficient strategy like the institutional designers think would happen, like the equilibrium selection strategy that we get. And you say, why would anybody play the corrupt strategy? It's well, because I may benefit from being corrupt. So how would I do this? I could say, well, if we both play corrupt, we get 1. If we both play safe, we get A. And if we both play best, we get B, and where B is bigger than A is bigger than 1. But if I play corrupt and the other person's safe, I get nothing. If I play corrupt and the other person plays B, I get this payoff D, and they lose D, right? So I get D and they lose D. So playing the best strategy puts you at risk a little bit, right? And if you do this, you can do all this out. I just showed you the math here, but like you get these, sort of basins of attraction for best, safe, and corrupt. When we think about then how agent-based models can help us here, you could say, okay, we don't want to think of this as a basin of attraction in the traditional sense. We want to think of there being a population of people, this is the Petri dish, when they confront an institution, they're going to have some sort of beliefs or set of pre-existing behaviors that lead them to either sort of have some perception of, I think people are going to play mostly best, right? And some corrupt, but not very much safe. And this person might think, I think people are going to play safe, right? So you want to have some sort of way, given the game, where do I place these agents? And so I thought, okay, well, how would you do this given the existing data we've got? And you could say, okay, well, let's just suppose here's Hofstede's thing: power, individualism, uncertainty avoidance, masculinity, long-term outlook, indulgence. And I could think, okay, if I were operating in a hierarchy and I got the corrupt outcome, what would happen to my individualism? It's like, well, I might become more individualistic. If I got the best outcome, what would happen? I might become less individualistic. So I can just, as my son would say, I was just making this blank up, right? I mean, he's like, here's the thing, there's no data on this. There's data on distributions across this, but there's not data on kind of like, how do these things change as a function of our experiences, right? And this is kind of what Agent Zero is all about, right? So what you could try and do now, and this is the kind of pins and strings thing, is you could say, okay, I've got Hofstede's measures, or I've got Inglehart's measures, which is the cloud, the dark matter, the Petri dish, whatever you want to call it. I have an institution, I get allocations, and now the cloud changes. And remember, we saw that in Inglehart's model, right? We see countries change on these dimensions over time. Culture is changing, and it's not idiosyncratic. It changes in ways that depend on how well institutions work, right? And then you do this again, you have another institution or things changing in, and culture changes. Now I'm showing that sort of distribution, the dark matter, the Petri dish, the cloud, whatever you want to call it, shrinking. Here's where we need to enter Agent Zero enter the picture. And we need to say, what kind of micro level data do we need in order to construct really good agent-based models to understand what are the conditions under which we'll get sort of robust flourishing? What are the conditions under which we're going to get, right, democratic collapse? What are the conditions under which we get life is cold, brutish, and short? This approach surveys six-dimensional factors, don't work with Agent Zero. Yet we know a lot, and Matt Jackson will speak about this tomorrow a little bit, I hope. We've got a whole bunch, a plethora of agent-based models that sort of in which information and knowledge accumulates over time, behaviors and norms accumulate over time, beliefs accumulate over time, and networks evolve over time. If you watch, so think of just running Sugarscape, a very simple model from this perspective. The agent zeros at the end of Sugarscape look quite different than the agent zeros at the end of Sugarscape. I mean, at the beginning, right? They've got different behaviors and norms. If you draw networks, their networks differ. And if you even think in terms of beliefs, if you sort of drew implicit beliefs in them, those would differ. So rather than these factors that we're drawing from surveys, I think what we need to do is really think hard about what are measurable things that matter in terms of driving people's behaviors. And I think information, knowledge, behaviors and norms, beliefs, networks, and these things, and that's what I'm talking about, Matt will talk about this, different network structures give you different outcomes, right? And this is one of the things you can use IGSS techniques for. You can say, what would have to be true of the network in order to give me this sort of outcome? What would have to be true of the network to give me this other sort of outcome? So the idea is to have a set of micro foundations that are not factors from survey, but have micro foundations that are built for Agent Zero. And we saw this in the epidemiological models during COVID. People started trying to gather data that would work for the types of models they were using. So now what happens is I have some initial level of civic capacity, I put a market in place, and certain behavioral repertoires suddenly then become improved. Like I have more coordination, maybe an increase in trust, and the networks that I get are likely maybe to be a little more small worldy and based on sort of like, you know, economic interest as opposed to sort of just being random, right? So what you get here is the information, the repertoires, the belief systems, networks all change as a function of the market. Now, if I do that mapping, before I had that kind of like ad hoc thing before, now if I say, what does a market do for knowledge, repertoires, beliefs, networks, right? Well, a hierarchy, you tend to be more, you know, rule following, risk averse, power-based belief networks, right? In a market, we know people tend to be self-focused. They tend to be more self-interested and strategic. Their beliefs are more, you know, they're willing to accept more inequality. Their networks are formed on self-interest. I know if I've got a self-organized community, people are more other-focused, right? There's more altruistic repertoires. Beliefs are tend to, you know, there's high degrees of trust. There's belief in equality. Social networks tend to be more dense, right? So we've actually got good ideas about how these things that matter, knowledge, repertoires, beliefs, and networks, change as a function of institutions. So here's a really simple Python model I wrote that sort of like plays with this. And here's one run, right? And what you're seeing is the first thing, individual is the x-axis, other regarding preferences or degree of altruism is the other axis. This is just a 100-period loop. So you're seeing the culture change in these three diagrams. I'm starting out with just kind of a scatter shot. And here you're seeing the institutional ensemble change, right? In this particular one, you see that we get a high degree of markets and algorithms. And you can see this kind of the flattening of the cloud that I showed you before. And if I look at the end of this, here's three things to note. One is average payoff is 2.7, and I've scaled this so it can be from 0 to 8. People are very individualistic, right? So they're over here like 75 on a scale from 100. I'm using Hofstede sort of scales here, but they're not very other regarding. So they're kind of selfish and individualistic, right? And trust is pretty high, right? So I mean, you can see trust on this side, it's 50 to 70, it's not bad, right? Now I'm gonna run the exact same model again. So I spent last week doing it, just watching hundreds of these things, right? What's amazing is the way this happened to have been set up is it's wildly path dependent. So here's another one. And you can see in this one, we're getting, and these were the two I just ran this morning just for fun, so it wouldn't be biased anyway. You're getting a high degree of sort of community-based or self-organization and democracies. And if I look at what happens at the end of this, look at how trust is now really high. It's at 75, right? Whereas in the previous one, trust was at 58. Altruism or other regarding is at 51, whereas previously it was at only 20, right? So this case, I end up getting this world where, you know, people are more trusting, they're more other regarding, purely as a result of just kind of the path dependence of the system. So now I can say, let's run this a bunch of times and I get a bunch of different results. Fine. What's so cool about this conference, and one of the things it's just really changed how I think about it. So now I've done this and I can think, wait, I should be able to use AI to categorize these. So I took like 8 runs and the 8 runs all fell into one of these sort of 4 things so far, right? One is kind of markets, like the one we saw first, where people tended to be kind of selfish and individualistic and there's modest levels of trust. Then we see this one up here in the upper right, where it's pretty diverse. It's almost like an even split across the institutions. Average payoff is 3.9, right? Levels of altruism and self-interest. This is other regarding on this axis, or you can think of it on this axis here, it's at 50%, right? So people are kind of evenly split between selfish and altruistic and pretty high levels of trust. Down here in this corner, where it's heavily community-based, right? Average payoff is 5.5, which is really high. Trust is almost off the charts, 90, right? Altruism is really high, 76, and kind of like individualism, you know, 50%, right? So people, I mean, in terms of like, you know, individualism is like, are you risk-taking, that sort of stuff. Over here, and I got a bunch of runs that went this way, algorithms just took over for whatever reason, right? Because I got bad outcomes and other things, and algorithms tend to never give really bad outcomes. And so algorithms took over. Then I end up with a really loose culture. The cloud doesn't converge as much. This isn't meant to in any way be empirically valid in any sort of way. It's just what I'm showing you is like what you've got here, and this, putting this in the terms of Coleman's boat, you could ask, what's going on at the macro level, which is this distribution across institutions, how is that changing? the pictures in the upper, the three other pictures are sort of showing what's going on at the micro level, and the whole thing is connected. What you'd like to do with agent-based models is have a deep understanding of, for each, are there categories of types of outcomes, and are there things that made the system sort of go to those to one of those 4 or 5 categories. This should resonate for those of you who are, study political economy, to just an incredibly powerful book that came out, I think now 2 years ago, called The Narrow Corridor by Ensemble and Robinson, who say if you look at societies historically, there's kind of power of the state, which is kind of like rule following, hierarchical organizations, power of society, which is kind of individualism, right? And there's this narrow corridor where if you kind of shackle the Leviathan, you get this sort of flourishing society. And if you fall off either edge, you don't. And it's interesting, right? Without any efforts to sort of produce that, you get not just those patterns, but all sorts of patterns. And I think one of the ways to think about this is not to think about this as country level data, but think of this as organization, community, school district, right? How well did this government program work in this particular community, right? Or why didn't this, thing that we worked on to reduce crime in St. Louis work in Minneapolis, right? So any institution in any well-defined place. So to conclude then, what I find fascinating about this is this notion of sort of what Morgan called dark matter, and then our attempts to play around in what I call in a recent piece, the Georgian Hypercube, and this notion of IGSS. So let me sort of walk through these really quickly, right? So again, when we think about how well an institution works, that depends on this dark matter, this cloud, and I think the institutions do affect the dark matter, right? And what I think is a challenge and an open question for this community is, to what extent can we carve the dark matter at its joints, right? So here's one of these kind of optical illusions where if I look at a 3-dimensional thing from any set of 2 dimensions, I get a very different understanding of what it is, right? But if I looked at it all 3 sets of 2 dimensions, then I could figure out what it was. And so because I think we can't necessarily carve dark matter at its joints, I think we have to sort of explore what I call the Georgian Hypercube, where, so Borges has this great, story about the maps, right? Where they have the map that's the exact size as the country, right? And it's worthless. So you can imagine, like, if I have all sorts of data, if I include every single attribute I can include, I've got a map that's the same thing as the world, and that's kind of useless for me. If I make it too simple, I'm down in this other left-hand corner, kind of like a game of life on a grid. That's not very useful either. I don't think there's a perfect model. I think what we want to do, right, is sort of like explore different, add attributes, add features, explore things, look at things from different angles, and try and get an understanding of the shape, try and understand the dark matter through using ensembles of models. I think the challenge for this community, I think, and also the real opportunity is, if you want to link this to empirical data in a meaningful way, and again, this isn't my strength, so I feel a little bit out on a limb saying this, you want to sort of, I think, decide what are the set of things that we should be collectively encouraging people to collect, right? So that we have, so networks would seem to be one thing, beliefs would seem to be one thing, behaviors would seem to be one thing, norms would possibly seem to be. So are there sort of sets of things we should be collecting across a variety of domains so that we can get a better understanding of how to construct models across this Georgian hypercube? So quick parting thought. Before I started, putting this together and thinking about this for the last few months, it didn't occur to me that IGSS is really a foundation for implementation science, which, maybe we should bring Josh in on this, which is a huge thing in health policy, right? Like, we're in education. If we had student university, we're sitting in, this is true in educational policy as well, right? Like, if it works here, does it work there? And this core question of what has to be true for this to happen at the macro level, the bottom of Coleman's boat, is the basis for this huge field called implementation science. And I think a real possibility for some exciting sort of large scale social science work. I think we also really need to think about a science of the petri dishes and dark matter. As Josh mentioned, I was kind of brought up believing that, yep, all we need are preferences and behaviors and technology. These were sort of like handed down on stone tablets by Arrow, DeBrue, McKinsey or something, and that's all there was. And in fact, like if you think of Eleanor Ostrom's work or Steve Lansing's work or Ann Swidler's work, the dark matter, right, the norms, the customs, the networks, the belief systems, the behavior repertoires, the toolkits, all that stuff really matters for outcomes, and it's affected by the institutions that we use. The last 2 points, just to read out what I just said, is so much of our current data is based on sort of survey stuff, which isn't suited, and factors. I don't see, maybe I'll learn something in the next 2 days, but I don't see how factor analysis is well suited to mapping to agent zero. I mean, I showed you that my kludge, but it strikes me as problematic. And then the last point is I think that there's just incredible opportunities, ABM, AI, machine learning, to explore this sort of Georgian Hypercube of models, to sort of reach some understanding without going to the full, map the size of the world. Right. Thank you very, very much. I realize that was a lot.
Thank you, Scott. That was a spectacular talk. Very, very provocative, wonderful, fascinating work as always. Bill, as the timekeeper, I'm not sure how much time we have, but I'm sure Scott would be happy to take questions. I can't really see all the participants, so it's tough for me to tell who has their hand up and who doesn't.
So we have about 10 minutes, and I see that Patrick actually has his hand up right now. So
great.
I'll turn it over to fellow Michigander Patrick there to ask you about first question.
This is great. This is wonderful stuff. This is really enlightening. And I love simple models. So I hate to ask you about necessities for complicating this model. But that's what my question is about, because the model is presented talks of as if you have a population, all of which has the same culture, or all of which has the same civil capacity, or if you have a society with just one institution. But if you have one with the military that has one culture and has one particular kind of hierarchy, and you have a dominant religion which may have a different culture but also a hierarchy, aren't we going to need a second level that's sort of social game theory in terms of what happens when you have these different cultures and these different institutions and how they meet and how that plays in?
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that I see this as kind of like a first step to sort of say, like, we know organizational culture matters a lot. We know national culture, the Petri dish, the dark matter matters a lot. And this is something I think that sociologists and anthropologists for a long time have sort of said, this is why we need narratives, and this is why the simple models of economists don't work. We need to go in and sort of deeply explore. And I think that that's true. You do, but I also think that if there aren't regularities there, then social science is really up a tree, right? Because we're not going to be able to construct institutions, design institutions that work, right? So I think that so at the moment I'm saying, let's even just try and go really simple and ask, and that's why I think this may be of more value to people doing the work like List and Susskind are doing, where they're doing like programs in communities, right? And I think one thing that'd be a really sort of fun experiment to do would be to take the exact same institution, have it done in the military, have it done in some other setting that's much more communitarian, and see what differences they get. And then you think, oh, that's been done, right, by Henrik Bohl's Ensminger, where they did the ultimatum game across a variety of different cultures, right? So we know that these, that the Petri dish matters. I think the real question is, how do you sort of make an institution work with awareness of the Petri dish? And how do you think about sort of like creating a sort of a fast learning in the institutional design space? If we're trying to improve schools or something like that, where you don't have this kind of naive idea that this worked in place A, it's going to work in place B. But yeah, no, I think you're right. It's just got to get more complicated to be practical value.
Good. Other questioners? Trying to see if anyone has their hand up or not. Bill Rand, do you see hands raised, or people who are brave and have their hand raised? Would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
I'm looking through. I don't see anyone right now. But,
well, I have one if you don't mind. So whenever I see a simplex, I think of Scarf's counterexample, and I'm wondering if you get cycling in this space of MHDAs. And also when you arrive at these equilibrium distributions, all of which are wonderful, can you shock them into other equilibria? again, sort of how stable are they? Do you get cycles? And have you tried to do a little bit of shock experimentation? Can you blast that equilibrium and does it drift off to some other one?
Yeah, so this is where, this is where, I'm link this back to Patrick's question a little bit, and I'm interested in Matt Jackson's take on this as well, is that, so part of our initial impetus for doing this is to think about, and Kate Anderson commented on this, is like, there's like online labor markets now, and also during Zoom now, a lot of stuff is not being done kind of in person, it's being done kind of algorithmically in some sort of online fashion. And that's going to have, I think, a huge effect on the dark matter, on the culture, and on social networks and all sorts of stuff, right? That's why I mentioned Matt's take on this. And so what our plan was in laying this out was like to think, okay, suppose you have markets, hierarchies, democracies, and what we're calling self-organization, where you just kind of like let her rip, just whatever happens, happens, let the norms. And then you throw algorithms in as this new technology. And you also assume that the increase in computational power and networking and information advantages markets more than the other institutions. So suddenly make markets a little more effective. Does that disrupt the equilibrium, right? Does that change sort of the patterns that you get? And so that was kind of one of our core initial question is like, could technology be the cause of democratic collapse? Like that thing I saw, showed you in that picture.
Yeah.
One of the things we found though in doing this is that, that's why I was showing the clouds or the dark matter, is that it's not the midpoint of the, like the mean strategy doesn't make sense if you got agent zeros all moving around, because the variance matters a ton, right? So I have a whole bunch of people that are way over in this one corrupt corner. Unless they're learning really fast, they can still be in the corrupt best response case, right? And so variance so the size of the cloud matters a lot in terms of how disrupted it is. I mean, the 3x3, the 3 institution case does go to equilibrium, and we set up a model so that works that way. But when you construct these larger ones, I mean, yeah, it looks like it goes to equilibrium. I got to run it 10,000. I got 10,000 institutions before it goes to equilibrium. Right?
Yeah, also, right, sure.
What intrigues me here is like this narrow corridor idea, which I think is right in very broad strokes of Acemoglu and Robinson. I mean, I think you make a really compelling case, but I think the corridor is higher dimensional than that. Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, wonderful talk as usual, Scott. A question about the, forces on democracy, and I guess this buried a little bit in the model, but it also is something that it seems like a useful extension to pull out would be how different are the cultures that different people are experiencing. So part of the strain seems to be that the different individuals end up with very different views, and democracy fails because you've got this kind of polarization and fundamentally different cultures. And I don't know whether that's happening inside the model, that different people are, is there a heterogeneity issue that comes, that sort of pops up inside here somehow? So that's the one part I'm not.
Yeah, so this is why, I was interested in your take on this, because right now we haven't, the obvious place to go this is put people in a network and have these institutions play out differently in different places, right? And so allowing for polarization of beliefs, polarization of outcomes, and everything else. And that will then maintain this heterogeneity in the cloud, which seems to matter a lot. And so one of the big learnings I would say from this that's come out of this for Jen and I is that, like, wow, the networks matter more than we thought they matter. Because if everybody's experiencing the same thing, these things almost have like this Markov-like quality to them. Once you sort of allow people to have different experiences as a function, then all bets are off. And what the interesting thing then is that the institutions you choose determine what the networks look like, which determines whether people get different experiences, right? Yeah, so it's where we'd like to go. Yeah, Georgie, give it.
Hi, I just had a quick comment or question about these models, and what has been fascinating to me is just trying to project. I'm not working much with economics, so I don't understand much of the economy except like supply and demand and Nash equilibrium. But what I've been seeing in biology, say I do a lot of work in addiction and drug use and whatnot, and what I see is that we believe that there is a homeostasis and that the body is trying to reach certain homeostasis. But in fact, what happens is that there is a notion of allostasis, meaning that as soon as you're getting close to an equilibrium, the equilibrium points start shifting, something starts changing. And so you're in a constant shift of that equilibrium point because things are being adapted. And so what I've been seeing, again, very naively in many economic models, and so some of the models that you're presenting is that, well, okay, you just change the parameters and this will be the equilibrium state. But what we see that the societies are constantly changing, and we don't know what happens now. Like we suddenly got internet, we got iPhones, and then we got COVID, and suddenly, you know, things that we believed in and whatever could be the structures that we presented, they start shifting. And can we capture that? Because most of the work say, okay, here's a set of parameters, this is what the result. But things are constantly moving. So that's what are your thoughts about it?
No, I think, yeah, really quick, I absolutely agree. And I'm gonna post in the chat. I have a really simple site on kind of emergence of inequality that it's a simple sort of agent-based model that it's on a Google site right there, which kind of addresses exactly that question, which is that, like, yeah, you can, once you start throwing in these sort of like pure effects and homeostasis and positive and negative feedbacks within types, you can find that policies have actually almost no effect, right? I mean, we tend to have this kind of linear causal view of things. And this was an attempt to try and explain what systemic effects were that occur within complex systems. I absolutely agree. Graham, do you have, let's go quickly to Graham and then maybe that's the last one.
I think that's right.
Graham, go ahead. Hey, Graham.
Hey, good to see you, Scott. That was wonderful. I kept thinking over the course of this about, it seems to me intuitively like it should matter quite a bit what other institutions are producing the algorithms that are in question, rather than just treating them as a separate category. So, so for example, in the United States, obviously, I would think the majority of the algorithms that are generated within a market economy system that's geared towards, in the case of, say, Silicon Valley, optimizing the amount of time that people spend on screen or things like this, right? So algorithms get sort of institutionally captured by markets, and that's radically different than, say, the way that things are maybe unfolding in China, where you have the development of algorithms in a context for, things like facial recognition that reinforce governmental authority. So I was just wondering, as I was sort of looking at the course of the model versus just treating algorithms as sort of a separate institutional category on their own, the way in which algorithms are captured by other institutional actors, or the importance of what institutional actors are producing the particular algorithms that begin to arise, if that's accounted for in some way that I missed.
No, I absolutely agree. And Tom Malone has this wonderful book called Superminds, where he thinks of algorithms as just kind of an add-on to each of the other institutions, right? So he would sort of say like markets, algorithmic markets, hierarchies, algorithmic hierarchies, and thinks of how they make them better. One of the reasons why we separated them up, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the type of algorithm matters a lot for what behaviors it creates, right? What networks it creates, those sort of things. The reason we separated off was to highlight the fact that we think the sets of kind of like, and I think we've all learned this during the Zoom era, right? That like non-in-person interactions lead to very different sort of behavioral repertoires than actually sort of person-to-person sort of interactions. There's a certain dehumanizing aspect to those things. Also, when your preferences are just elicited, we also want to think about it like somebody elicits my preference and then gives me an allocation, right? Like I think of the medical school matching thing. I mean, it's, but you're right, like you can run a market as an algorithm, right? I mean, so it's a pile of sand argument. What's a market? What's an algorithm? But it's and I think we need to Tom Malone and I argued about that. In fact, we were arguing about it yesterday. It's not clear what the right way to think about it is, and maybe getting back to kind of like Matt's point, what you really learn is you want to think about, okay, when I put some institution in play, what is the distribution of effects this has on people, right? And that could be polarizing, that can make the cloud wider, that can make the cloud tighter, and maybe even this categorization as markets, hierarchies, algorithms, democracies isn't even the right way to go, right? we're just using this as a placeholder to give this idea that institutions affect systems, systems affect institutions.
That's great. Great. Well, it's 12, it's about 12:05, almost 12:10. And to give Rob a little chance and get everybody to have a break, I want to thank Scott very much for a fascinating, wonderful talk, very provocative and interesting. Look forward to following up, and all the questions are great. And let's break and reconvene at 12:30, I believe. Is that right, Bill?
That is correct. So
okay, good.
And I should say quickly that, I just want to put a quick plug. If you are presenting today, tomorrow, or on Thursday, please send the slides to me so I can get up online, right? And we can make them available for everybody. We've had a couple of requests already. And the URL, the Zoom URL, is the same throughout the entire workshop right now. I know some people have had some troubles getting it, but hopefully if you're here now, you have it. And so just keep this URL around. It'll be the same tomorrow and the next day as well. So